Okay, I think we're going to get started. Let me adjust my chair. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to have this is our first webinar. Everybody see that okay? Can you give me a thumbs up, Matt? You see my screen? Andy sees it? Great. This is our first webinar, and we're going to kind of feel our way into this. I just want to say that the reason that we're doing this is we're trying to foster collaboration. We've built a really cool sensor, we think. We think it has a lot of utility across the entire world. We also know that in order to cover the map, which is ultimately the goal of Pollen Sense, it's to cover the world and to count pollen in an automatic fashion, uniform fashion, make the data available to everyone and useful to everyone, both researchers, clinicians, anybody in between, and also, of course, the end user, the allergy sufferer, or people who in some way need or want to consume pollen data. That's our goal. And so the more that I've done this, the more that I've talked to people, the more I've realized the way to do this is to work together, to collaborate, and to make sure everybody gets what they need out of it. So here's our little program. I'm going to do a short presentation. I want to give some updates on the company. I also want to level set, make sure everybody in the company or everybody in the meeting knows what Pollen Sense is about. So I'm gonna do that, and then I'm gonna talk about a couple of ideas and a couple of things that I think are important in collaboration, and some important points that I want to bring out to make sure people understand how our technology works and can work for collaboration. Gonna have then a discussion with Andy Johnson, and we're just going to talk air quality and some different stuff, and I'll introduce Andy here in a second, and then we're going to open it up to question and answer. We're scheduled to be about an hour. My guess is we'll go 45 minutes unless there are lots and lots of questions, and I'm happy to answer questions until people get bored. Okay, so I want to start with the company background. I was trying to put together some pictures of the founders and the team, and I couldn't get them all together. It was kind of a last minute, oh yeah, it'd be really cool to show faces. I wasn't able to do that. So here's some plants and an old school Burkhardt pollen and spore trap. My start with pollen counting and the world of air quality was my PhD at the University of Tulsa, where I studied juniper species, mainly Juniperus ashii, and I logged 6 of these pollen traps from Texas to central Texas, well, from the hill country of Texas to west central Texas to New Mexico, and around and around. I moved those, and I spent a good part of my PhD counting pollen. And when I finished, I said, this has got to be automated. I have got to figure out how to do this. I didn't know how to start a company. I didn't know how to invent things. And I was at a conference right after my PhD. I was standing in front of a poster, and my partner, Rich Lucas, walked up to me, and he said, I didn't know him. And he walked up to me and he said, you count pollen? And I said, yeah, I've counted a lot of pollen. He said, why is this not automated? Why are people still doing this manually? And I said, well, it's actually quite difficult. It's complicated to automate it. And then I said, but I want to do it. I have a sketch, and I even showed him my sketch. I had it on in my notebook. I said, this is the design. And honestly, the design we use today is very similar to the sketch I made. Rich was a scientist as well, and he's a statistician. Neither one of us could invent, so we went looking for a few more people, and we found Nathan Allen and Kevin Lamson. That was the core team, the founding team. They're really good tinkerers. They build all kinds of cool things in their garage. They were actually building a weeding robot when we found them, and we convinced them that pollen counting was more interesting. And we founded Pollen Sense. It wasn't too long after that David Brent Knoll found us, and he had some skills that we desperately needed in taking a prototype to actual manufacturing. And those 5 founders are the core group. We have with us also Matt Gurgiolo, who is our director of sales, and I think we have some other team members here. I can't see the list when I'm in presentation mode, but we have some other team members, I think, as well on the call. That's the company background. And our goal when we sat around together digitally, because we were all in 4 different states at the time when we founded the company, the goal was, this doesn't exist. How cool would it be if we invented this and we made it, we willed it into existence, and we filled the world with sensors. That was our goal, and continues to be our goal. So briefly, if you want an in-depth description of the technology, I'm happy to take a call and we can do a meeting. But here's briefly the technology. Our APS technology captures particles. It images them, it identifies them, and then it reports those levels and those identified particles to the cloud, where you can disseminate the data in many different ways. And we're quite proud of the technology we've built. We think it has a lot of utility. We build it for pollen and mold. There are a lot of other libraries that we can build, and maybe we can talk about that in the discussion at the end if people are interested. Our new sensor, the APS 400, some of you have the APS 300 series, 330s, 300s. Our new version, if you haven't seen it, is this here. I wish I'd brought one. It's about this big, small lunchbox size. The upgrades are, it's smaller and lighter. It has a cartridge system, so you don't have to mess with the reel-to-reel system as much. And it also has some better imagery. And the better imagery is a more stabilized image, and so it's crisper and cleaner, and it helps you identify things better. So I have a couple of prompts here that I hope will spur some discussion at the end, and also some discussion with Andy here in a second. Like I said, the goal of Pollen Sense is ultimately to fill in the map. And so I've done some different analyses and different estimates on how do we achieve the critical mass and what is critical mass. I think the best place to look, if you don't know, is Europe. There are many European countries that have benefited from government-funded manual monitoring networks. France is a great one. The UK is a great one. I shouldn't have started listing them, because there are lots of good countries there that have manually counted pollen, and it's expensive and time-consuming, but they've done a tremendous job, and they've tremendously benefited their community. But most regions in the world, including the US, have not had government-funded pollen counting activities. They haven't had the density, and it's been kind of haphazard. So I did a quick analysis, and obviously with automated sensors, we require fewer people. It's less expensive, and you don't require the expertise to enter the pollen counting world. You can measure it with a sensor instead of having to train somebody and retrain somebody and have people count on the weekends. The sensor counts year round, every day, all day. So if you go to this really good website, you can see there it's hosted by this university in Munich. They display, you can find this on Google, they display all of the pollen counting activities that happen all over the world. Now, obviously, people have to submit that information in order to get on the map, but Europe has about 600 manual counting stations, and that means there's a sensor about every 6,400 square miles or an 80 by 80 grid. Now, they've strategically placed them based on vegetation and topography and things like that. But our research, and we actually have an app called Pollen where we collect data and people enter their symptoms. So we actually have a good idea of which data represent or which data are useful to people. How far from a sensor, or how close to a sensor rather, do you have to be in order to have the data be representative of your symptoms? And our studies show that for a daily average, like how do I feel today? Was it a bad day or a good day? Uh, we need a sensor every 10,000 square miles or 100 by 100 mile grid, and that's adequate for a daily average. So, if you look at North America, the saturation for a daily average would be 600 sensors. Now we took the square mileage of it, but we also removed some real open country in northern Canada and the Plains states, and we said, well, we need some in different cities to represent small cities. We hit 600 sensors. For Europe, it's 400. So by our estimation, they're slightly oversaturated. I'm sure they would say we're definitely not. I'm sure they would say we know exactly what we're doing, which I'm not going to argue with that. But we think would need about 400 sensors. I didn't do this analysis for every region in the world, but those densities are pretty good densities and a pretty good indication. Now, there are lots of confounding factors, including topography and vegetation distribution. The next layer of this, though, is the hourly coverage. And in order to have the hourly data that our sensor reports on the hour be representative of the symptoms that people are reporting in our app, we found that we need a much denser uh, coverage, 6,000 sensors in North America, 4,000, so a 10x amount. And the reason I bring this up is we often get this question when people are talking about building little networks, regional networks. How many sensors do I need? What is critical mass? And these are very rough estimates, and they're extrapolated over large areas. There's a certain amount of analysis that has to be done for each region. Okay, so that's just kind of a high level. I get this question all the time. How much density? What does your sensor do? I think those are good to kind of set the table. I want to highlight a couple of things in our technology. Number one, we are all about sharing and collaborating. And so we've built into the sensor. If you have a sensor, you have access to our portal. If you have access to our portal, you have the ability to share access to your sensor with anybody you want. That can be people in your organization, that can be people outside of your organization. And so there's a share tab. I'm not going to go into details on how that's done, but this allows you to do some cool things. You can easily disseminate data that because they can go there and they can download the data themselves. You can collaborate on quality control and quality assurance. There's nothing that says that our sensor has to be completely automated all the time. It's never going to be perfect. Believe me, I've been working with machine learning, artificial intelligence for a decade now. It's never going to be perfect. It gets better and better with time, but there's always going to be a new particle that we want to identify. It's always going to be cool and good and beneficial to have people on the back end going through and doing quality control. We have a cool system for that. That's a different topic. I don't want to go too deep into this, but it's also easy to monitor sensors. If people are sharing the data, everybody can get alerts when a sensor goes down or when something is important to know about the sensor, like it's time to change the tape cartridge. Okay, one more topic. I want to talk about the power of the network. Now, everyone who has purchased a sensor de facto belongs to the PollenSense network. You don't have to share your data with everybody in the network. You don't have to collaborate with anybody if you don't want to. But when you do certain activities that I'm going to show you, everyone benefits. The first one is image corrections. And I'm not going to demonstrate how you do that here, but there is a mode we call view tags where you can see every particle that has been identified, or if you want to see every pollen type or every mold type that has been identified, you can go through and visually confirm, yes, this is correct, or this is not correct. In the last year and a half, we've had 17,566, and that number goes up every day, image corrections where people all over the world are saying, that's not right, this is right. And that has been extremely beneficial in improving our image identification. So there is a process after that. Once they've made the correction, it goes into a QC folder. I do most of the quality control, and I review all of the images and all of their corrections, all 17,000 of them. And I all of the good images will make it into our library. Once they've made it into our master library, we do a retrain. So we tell the machine learning, okay, here's some new images, learn these images, get better at identifying. And it does that. And thanks to the 17,000 plus corrections, the bar keeps going up. The quality of our identification keeps going up. One other thing that has been beneficial is related to our dynamic vision model system. So if you don't know, our dynamic vision model system is mostly a system of exclusion. We exclude pollen types or mold types, but mostly pollen types that should not be found in a given area at a given time. So this is a segment, a representative segment. So this is Stockholm, January, February, and March. And you can see that under vision model segment, it says POL, and then at the end it says ALN CORY. So alder and corylus, alder and hazelnut are the only two pollen types in that area during the days January 1 through March 11th. And then a new model kicks on, and it's got more pollen. And the way that everyone benefits from this is when we onboard somebody, we do our best to work with whoever's in the area setting up the sensor. We work closely with them to make sure we know the pollen history. We know what pollen types are out there. And sometimes they have actual pollen data that we use and we ingest and we create these models. And sometimes we just have conversations and we make our best guesses and we improve these models over time. So if you can imagine, you have this calendar of when pollen should arrive and what types of pollen should arrive at any given time. And once we've built these, and we've trained 187 of these worldwide in the last 18 months. Once those are trained, if somebody comes online and they're inside of one of those segments, they've already got some intel. They've already got an existing model, a dynamic vision model, and trained and ready to go. And oftentimes we'll find that we need to create a new dynamic vision model for a given period of time because they're a few hundred miles away. But it's really cool. The more we do this, the more there are already models trained and ready to go. And people are benefiting from those who have blazed trail before them. So it just to drive this home a little further, if you have a sensor, you can see what dynamic vision models are running on your sensor by clicking the Manage tab. And you can see that my sensor is running the upper Intermountain West segment for June and July right now. And so I'm approximately in the center there below Salt Lake City. Anybody inside of that box and inside of that polygon is going to be using my dynamic vision model calendar until they build their own. And it's a nice baseline. It's a nice starting point. And yeah, okay, the mountains of Wyoming are a little delayed, and when we get sensors in the mountains of Wyoming, we'll have to make adjustments. But it's a good baseline, and this baseline was set by the network, by the people who have purchased sensors and worked with us to set this up. We've also trained 15 new pollen and mold libraries in the last 12 months, maybe 16 months. And again, this is something that everyone benefits from. And so we do this in a couple of ways. We have some people, we have some European collaborators who are feeding raw pollen in. They go and collect the pollen, they take their sensor inside, they put it in a clean room, or at least a clean room, and they feed the pollen in, and they tell us, hey, we fed some images in, we create a library for them. We also have people who are saying, hey, I have this type of pollen, it's coming into the sensor now, and if it's distinct enough, we can just grab those images, put them into a library, and retrain them. And again, PollenSense couldn't do these kinds of activities alone. It's the power of the group and the network. So the last thing I want to end with, before Andy and I start a little discussion here, is in an attempt to foster networking and collaboration. And we're envisioning people writing grants together, finding people through our network, and purchasing sensors together, and sharing data, and doing studies, whatever people want to do. And you can send me an email and say, hey, can you introduce me to so-and-so, or can you help me find somebody who wants to do such and such? But we also have the PollenSense Network YouTube channel and the PollenSense Network Facebook page. We can add a subreddit, we can add whatever, and you can start your own. Certainly we don't need to aggressively, actively foster all of the collaboration. We're just trying to make it possible for people to find each other. And so this is what we're starting with. So you can comment on a YouTube video and say, hey, I want to do what this video is talking about, or you can post on the Facebook page, hey, I'm looking for help to do this. I've set up a sensor, or I want to buy a sensor, whatever. I think you can imagine the possibilities. So that was my little presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can feel more connected to the group. And at this point, I just want to have a little discussion with you, Andy, and I wrote some notes. If my notepad it's a battery powered notepad, so it's always risky. So Andy Johnson is the Director of Air Quality Assessment in the division of, tell me if I get this wrong, division of Maine Department of Environmental Protection, Bureau of Air Quality. That's a mouthful. Was that close?
That's good.
That's it.
You got it.
Great. So Andy, first, tell us what that means. What do you do? What's your job?
Well, I manage a division in the Bureau of Air Quality at Maine DEP that does the ambient air quality monitoring for the state, implementing all the federally required monitoring that is used to protect air quality and compare for compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. But we also do other kinds of monitoring, like atmospheric deposition monitoring, a lot of meteorology measurements as well. And our more recent adventure is doing the pollen monitoring with the PS400s.
Yeah, and I know that when you're in a department like the one you're in, you wear a lot of hats. Sounds like you wear a lot of hats. How did how did Maine? How did your department decide to get into pollen measurement? What triggered it at this point? We kind of started this process maybe six or 9 months ago. These discussions. What was the impetus for that?
Well, I had the benefit of seeing your beta version of the PollenSense monitor at a CDC meeting in Atlanta back in 2016 or 17 or something like that. Yeah. So I had that awareness, and our current governor convened a climate change task force, and they have been meeting. It involves different people from different agencies across state government, but it was there was a definite emphasis on what can Maine do to address the climate change impacts that would be and are occurring currently, in the state. And in part of those conversations, I have some colleagues from our Maine Centers of Disease Control who were part of a technical science subcommittee for the Climate Council. And we had talked about this off and on, but we happen to mention that, it's well known or been, proposed or predicted that, with increasing temperature and moisture and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that, there's going to be an increase in the amount of pollen, the extent of the pollen season, starting earlier, lasting longer. And the council recognized that that was an important measure to be able to track and see how things were changing. So with my familiarity with your device, again, for me, having been in this air quality monitoring business for, oh my gosh, it's 44 years now. I can hardly believe it myself. But continuous monitoring has so many advantages over anything that is an integrated sample or manual. You just get so much more information. So even though there are I've stopped referring to them as the gold standards. I'm referring to them as the traditional standards of measuring, like the rotor rods and the Burkharts, because I'm not convinced that they're necessarily the best, but they're what we have the most familiarity with, the largest databases to compare, this new approach of doing it continuously through your technology. So we had been talking internally, and my colleague with Centers for Disease Control, they're involved in a BRACE grant. They get money. BRACE stands for Building Resistance Against Climate Changes, basically. I forgot the E, climate and whatever. But anyway, she applied for some money to acquire some pollen sensors, and we were successful in getting them. So that's how we got to where we're at. Obviously, Maine has one of the higher asthma rates in the country. And we know that, asthma can be exacerbated by allergies and things like that. So there were lots of health reasons from our colleagues in that perspective. But from an environmental climate change perspective, we also wanted to be able to track and see changes through pollen in terms of those kinds of impacts that are forecast and people are reporting that they're happening now.
Yeah, interesting. And it seems like climate change is, when we talk to our customers and people who are getting sensors, climate change is top of mind for I would say half of them. It's the reason that they're out looking for solutions in monitoring pollen. And certainly it's topical. That there's some wild stuff happening. That extreme rainfall event was a fun one in the Northeast that we discussed yesterday. You and I. Sounds pretty wild. Um, Talk to us a little bit about the history of pollen counting in Maine. And I'm not saying you know a lot, but I know you know a little bit, and you've shared a little bit of some studies from the past. Can you share with us what activities you're aware of?
Sure. We haven't had a lot of pollen monitoring, mostly using rotor rods, but I'll start from the earliest that I'm aware of. And there was actually a group back in the early 1950s that used an interesting collection device. Basically, it was just a little circular platform that sat outside with a little bit of a dome over it to prevent any kind of precipitation from washing whatever gravitationally settled onto this collection plate. And then they would take that back and then, through microscopy, identify the pollen types. And they actually published a report in 1951 with some great illustrations. And I was really impressed with even the mapping detail that they had back then. And this one report exists in the library at the University of Maine, and it's a little brittle, fragile. But we were able to borrow it. We looked at it, and I've shared I took photographs of certain pages that I thought were pretty interesting. We've requested that it be digitized so that we can more broadly share it. But that's our first awareness. And they had done like a half a year monitoring in the beginning, kind of figure work the bugs out. And then they did a full year like the next year. And more recently, we've had a couple of allergists that have sponsored monitoring at different locations in the state. The longest term one was in the area of Bangor, Eastern Maine, associated with the Eastern Maine Medical Center. There was an allergist there, Paul Shapiro, who championed that for like 20 something years, but they stopped about 5 or 6 years ago. I'm not sure exactly why. I think it had to do with costs, actually. And then we have a Native American tribe up in northern Maine, up in Presque Isle, of the Micmacs. And they started their pollen monitoring there in 2004, I believe, and it is continuing. And that's a manual process, a rotorod. Their environmental person who wears many hats for their organization as well, he's the one that actually counts, and they've got a pretty good record up there. And for a very brief period of time in southern Maine, at the Southern Maine Medical Center in Biddeford, they had some. That was the first time I actually ever went and saw a rotorod. They were sharing these numbers with the media back then, because they would include what the pollen was for the day and the molds. And so when we would get calls, being an air quality agency, about what all that meant, and it's like, well, we're not the ones doing it, so we're not sure. But I got to go and talk with them, see my first rotorod. It was up on the roof of the hospital, and saw their little space where they had their microscope and were doing that. So that's sort of been the extent. But as I said, I'm real excited about doing this continuously. We have 4 of the PS400s that we're in the process with an advisory group to decide where the best places in the state. For those that don't know, Maine in New England, in terms of its square mile area size, you can fit all the rest of New England in the state's geographical boundaries, or square miles. So it's a lot of territory to cover. 4 are not adequate. We discovered obviously right away we needed more. We'll see how we go about getting a couple more, but that's what's got us into what we're doing now in our collaboration. Landon's been very generous in sharing his perspective and knowledge. And the other thing we didn't mention is that I, in my capacity as a division director for Maine DEP, I'm also involved with the atmospheric deposition program that does precipitation chemistry, mercury, ammonia measurements in the national network. And this is what they do best. They build networks. It's very highly coordinated. It's a centralized laboratory, lots of quality assurance, quality control. And when we had these pollen summits at the National CDC campus in Atlanta, the Council for State and Territorial Epidemiologists in 2016 published a position paper that I thought absolutely made the case of why measuring pollen on a national scale was a real need. And they sent that out to like over a dozen federal agencies as part of this actual formalized process that required these agencies to respond about what they thought of the proposal. Every single one of them came back, thumbs up. Yes, it's important. Let's do it, whatever. Zero money. So we, after a few summits, are just saying, we need to do this network. We need to do this network. And that's when the little light bulb went on for me. Was like, well, geez, maybe NADP could play a role in helping to foster providing information and getting people involved and interested to join a coordinated network. It's just, as Landon, you just shared, that a lot of your customers are buying them. They don't have any connection. These webinars hopefully will be a good opportunity to bring people together. But that's been the goal of the Aeroallergen Monitoring Science Committee that I chair as part of NADP. And we have meetings twice a year. Landon's been there. He was there in May and shared updates with us. And we're starting to really get some traction, I think, in terms of it's just building this community, and the interest is growing. It's not going away. The real challenge is just finding those financial resources to, buy the equipment, and then have people who are dedicated and interested in wanting to pursue and understand how we best collect this information and then share and distribute in a meaningful way. Because again, my co-chairs when we started were both huge allergy sufferers, and it was, fortunately, I don't have that, but just empathizing with what their quality of life was impacted by in terms of their allergies was quite eye-opening, actually. So
yeah. Well, Andy, this is great. And I have a couple of follow-up questions. That you brought up a lot of interesting stuff. Um, the the loosely the organization of people who have manually counted pollen in the U.S. was the National Allergy Bureau. They were the biggest group, and they've done a
Right.
tremendous job. They've fought tremendous headwinds, and a lot of allergists who have counted pollen for decades are starting to hang up their hat and say it doesn't make sense. I'm part of a corporate entity now. I've been, I've been acquired, and it doesn't pencil. Why are we doing this? And the reason they were doing that mostly was to benefit the community. There were some studies and other things like that. But it seems like the allergists, a lot of them are waking up and going, this is not my job. I'm an allergist. I'm a clinician. That's my job. I need to consume the data. They're benefiting me and my patients. It gives us intel. Um, that position paper from the CSDE was a great one, and I think probably everybody on this call agrees that pollen counting should be done. Whose job is it, do you think, to measure pollen, and whose job is it, do you think, to fund it? And I don't know if this is a question out of line, but uh, I get uh, I've spent the better part of a decade, well, if you count my PhD, 15 years talking about who should count pollen and how do we fund this and why isn't it better in the US? The Europeans have figured out a great way to do that. They have slightly different organizations. In the US, whose job do you think it is? Should be.
Well, just I really equate it very much. It's so much aligned with basically just air quality monitoring. I mean, it's a measurement of particles in the air. And again, your sensor is marketed primarily, for identifying pollen and mold. But basically, if it's a particle that the camera can see and the collection media can trap, you're going to find it. And we've seen lots of examples of that. It's really eye-opening for people when they first see the images and see plastics and mineral particles and you name it. So I think there's a role for government at any level, local, state, federal. The challenge is that there is no law or rule or regulation that says thou shalt measure aeroallergens. Um, if that was the case, then they would have that legal framework, regulatory framework to then, acquire money and things like that. We came a little closer to that happening in the US when EPA's CASTAT program was proposing to want to put a pollen sense monitor at all the CastNet sites. That's a rural network that EPA has maintained primarily for the Clean Air Markets Division, where it's basically looking at the impacts from the power sector, primarily coal burning and things like that. It was measuring ozone and particles in more rural locations. A lot of states and resources go to where the people are, and sometimes we had a great network for urban areas and suburban areas, but not as good coverage in rural. So that's where the CastNet program kind of came in, and at one point was I think over just 100 sites across the country. But they were going to propose to put a pollen sense at each one of these, and that would have been a really awesome foot in the door, so to speak, to actually have it now be part of a federal agency's responsibilities to do that. And again, with climate, to me also, it's so closely aligned with the impacts of climate change that I think are important to track and measure. And when you look at the data that has been shared about the amount of money that consumers spend on over-the-counter medications to deal with allergy symptoms. Some of the last figures I saw, I think, were like from 2016, so that's like 7 years ago. But it was like over $12 billion a year that was spent on just dealing with symptoms. And so, one of the things we've learned, and I'm preaching to the choir here, is that the most effective, options for people who are on allergy medications is to get them started before the advent of really being exposed to the height of the pollen exposures. So knowing the onset of pollen season is really critical and it changes across the country and changes, with meteorology of the seasons and things like that. But there's no reason not to. There's all reasons to measure this thing. And so again, we've been reaching out and trying to build this growing momentum among people who have this interest. And so I think webinars like this, Landon, will hopefully go a long ways towards fostering that awareness. And I talk about it every chance I get when I'm at a EPA meeting. There's associations of state air quality agencies, NACA, National Association of Air Pollution Control agencies, and then another one is the Association of Air Pollution Control Agencies. So anyway, any chance I get, I'm trying to raise the awareness that this is an unmet need that impacts millions of people, quality of life, and if there's anything as public servants that we can do that really make a difference in people's lives, having this kind of data is one of them.
Yeah, well, that's you've said some awesome stuff here, and these organizations that you're mentioning, including the NADP and the subgroups of that, we're going to get some information together, and we'll send that out in our next newsletter so that people in the U.S. can see that and can figure out how to join and join meetings and learn more. We'll make sure and do that. I really hope that in the U.S. we'll get this baseline of a network that will be funded by the government. And then the cool thing about the sensor is anybody who says, well, this isn't dense enough for me, I want to add, I'm a little town in eastern Washington or something, I want to add a sensor, they can just plug right in and be a contributor to the network. So we hope to do that. Let's open it up to questions. We have a Q&A tab on this platform. So if you're shy or you just want to type it and you're not shy, you can type your question into the Q&A. Or Matt, I think we can just allow anybody to pipe in here, right? Unmute themselves, or
I believe so. Yes.
Matt will see if he can figure that out. But if you have a question, go ahead and type it in now. Andy, one last thing I have to mention to the group is that background is a quintessential Maine background that you're sitting in, and it's not a fake background. That is your background, right?
Oh, behind me? Yeah.
That,
yes, it is.
Those wood rooftop is just perfect. I mean, that's what we want you to look like in Maine. We want your house to look like that. So you've done a good job with that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm a plant person, so I like to bring a little bit of the indoors, outside, indoors, for the aesthetics.
It's important to have a little green in the long winters too, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
I actually have some banana trees out on my deck, but that's another story.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, that's cool.
I believe everybody should now be able to speak if they would like to ask a question, or they can type it in the Q&A.
Okay, and I see Bruce.
So you just have to,
go ahead, Matt. Sorry.
I was just gonna say you just have to unmute yourself and ask a question, or
yeah, exactly. And I see that Bruce Robertson is unmuted. Maybe Bruce, do you have a question or a comment?
I do, if you can hear me. I'm interested in once you get your network in place and more sensors spread around the country, about the API that I know you've been talking about.
Okay, yeah, great. So that's a great question. We have an API. We have a couple of different segments of API. Actually, we have a sensor-based API. So that you don't actually have to ask anybody at Pollen Sense to get access to. If you know somebody with a sensor, there's a sensor-based API, and they can share the key with you, and you can hit that sensor and obtain the data in a API stream. There's also an API for interpolated, basically a map of North America right now that we do. We'll have Europe soon. We'll have other regions soon. and as it gets more and more dense, then it gets more and more accurate. That API is interpolated data, and the reason we interpolate the data and the reason that we share it in that way is, one, we feel like it's useful if somebody needs the entire map, especially with the current density. We need to do some interpolation, but also we have committed to the sensor owners to not share their specific data. So if you were to hit that API and find a point in, Sheboygan, I always like to use Sheboygan because it's fun to say. If there was a point in Sheboygan that you wanted to hit, it would be interpolated data, not actual data. And that's to protect that researcher there, or if somebody has something that a project ongoing, they don't want to be scooped by sharing the data. So you would have to connect with them directly to get their exact sensor data. And then there's a third point API. And so you can hit different points around the country, and you can say, well, I'm only interested in 10 cities, so I'm going to hit 10 points, 10 very specific points. So there are 3 APIs: the sensor, the map, and the point API. And the sensor and the point API are essentially both a point, right? But there's kind of different concepts there. And the gatekeeper with the sensor API is the sensor owner. Pollen Sense is the gatekeeper with the other APIs. Any other questions there, Bruce?
Who would we talk to at Pollen Sense to talk about the API and accessing it?
You can talk to me. You can email info@pollensense.com, and you can just make an inquiry, and we'll set up a meeting.
Very good. Thank you.
I'll add that. Lynn, I'll add that in the chat.
Oh yeah, great.
I would note that this is Nate from Pollen Sense. I would note that it's also delivered as a self-serve portal. So if you have somebody that can speak API jargon, you can go onto our portal, and there's documentation, and it can guide, including examples. It can guide you through setting that up. So we've tried to make that self-serve. Also, one additional note about the latter 2 APIs that Landon mentioned, the interpolated APIs, is that it includes a forecast.
Oh yeah, thanks, Nate. Nate is our CTO and is in charge of those kinds of things, so you can tell he knows the details better than I do. Nate, will you post the API documentation in the chat?
Not sure if there is a chat that we can all see on this. Is there?
Oh, I thought there's a chat tab.
Yep.
You could also put it in the Q&A.
Okay, I'm not very familiar with this platform yet.
So that's okay. If you can get it, great. If not, info@pollensense.com, and we'll send you out anybody that wants the link to that. Any other questions? I don't see anybody else unmuted. And honestly, we've gone 51 minutes. I think this is a good meeting. Andy, thank you so much for sharing wonderful information and cool perspective. And it's going to be exciting. I hope we can have another discussion specifically about Maine and how they're deciding where to put these 4 sensors, because there's some tough decisions you got to make. Do you cover the map, or do you cover the population, right? We've discussed that a little bit. So,
Happy to do it.
Yeah, we'll have to do a follow-up on this. Thanks everybody for joining. We'll send out an email with another invitation for the next one. My guess is we'll probably do that in September. Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. See ya.
Thank you.